So I'd like to introduce Amy Golitz. She's a Master Gardener volunteer, and she joined Lake County Master Gardener Program in 2017. Way to go, Amy.
Okay, thank you, Susan. And good morning, friends. As Susan said, my name is Amy Golitz, and I'm here to talk to you today about ecological alternatives to lawns. So we want to say goodbye to lawnmowers and fertilizers and say hello to wildlife habitat, pollinators, and water conservation. Here is a very basic agenda of what I will be talking about today. I'm going to get started with why do we have lawns? The concept of a lawn was brought over from Europe, where the rich use lawns as a status symbol, and the turf grasses are native there. Lawns eventually migrated over to the United States, where again, the perfect weed-free lawn was considered a sign of wealth and prosperity. But here's the problem. Those European turf grasses are not native here. They are not adapted to our ecosystem or our climate, and they do not support our wildlife. Turf grasses are very shallow rooted, while unlike our native warm season grasses, which are very deep rooted. I've used this graphic before. It's a very good graphic. I've highlighted the Kentucky bluegrass, which is a typical turf grass that's planted all the way on the left-hand side. And look at how short those roots are. Just a couple inches. Compare that to our native bunch grasses, which I've numbered across the top. Indian grass, big blue stem, prairie dropseed, switchgrass, and little blue stem. The short roots are why those European turf grasses require so many inputs: water, fertilizer, pesticides, and continual mowing. In America, over 40 million acres of land are covered by turf grass. We work so hard for something that provides very little ecologically or aesthetically and isn't supposed to be here. I'd like to go over a few lawn input stats with you. Turf grass is the single largest irrigated crop in the United States. Turf grass sucks up 9 billion gallons of water daily, 90 million pounds of fertilizers annually, 78 million pounds of pesticides annually. These numbers are mind-blowing. The average American spends 70 hours a year on lawn and garden care, and lawn equipment sucks up 800 million gallons of gas annually, of which 17 million gallons are spilled and wasted. Doug Tallamy is a well-known professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology in the University of Delaware. Doug is currently organizing a grassroots call to action called Homegrown National Park, in which he encourages all homeowners to rewild their little piece of the world, to restore biodiversity, in the hopes that together all of our little pieces will equal the size of a national park or two. If you decide to convert your lawn, or if you already have native plant plantings, please register your lawn or your area on his website. I will be referring to Doug Tallamy and his work a lot in this presentation. I want everyone to know it is okay not to have a lawn. Imagine less mowing, less chemicals, more time, more money. How much lawn do you really need? Let's help restore biodiversity by converting your non-native turf grasses to native plants. Mark Richardson, formerly of the Native Plant Society, had this idea, and I just absolutely love it. He suggests you sort the areas of your yard into 3 categories. Category 1, where you could lose the lawn and not miss it. Category 2, where you would like a green ground cover, but not necessarily turf. And category 3, where a lawn is useful for children, pets, or entertaining. I am going to give you suggestions for each of these 3 categories and ideas on how to add more plants to your yard. I would like you, after this presentation, to take a stroll around your yard and think of these three categories. Look for areas of turf that you do not need. Maybe you use lawn alternatives to make life easier for you, to eliminate that oddly shaped area where mowing and edging is difficult. That's okay. Wildlife is still getting the benefit of the conversion no matter why you convert your turf. Before I go any further, I'd like to simply briefly touch on, although this slide doesn't look so brief, the definition of a native plant, because all the plants I'm going to suggest are native plants. A native plant is a plant that occurs naturally in an ecoregion and habitat, where over the course of evolutionary time, it has adapted to the physical conditions and co-evolved with other species in the ecosystem. There are many benefits of native plants. They provide food and shelter for our native birds and animals. They need less water when established, and they help to manage the flow of water with their deep roots. They need far fewer resources than turf grass. They attract beneficial insects like lady beetles, lacewings, and wheelbugs. And by planting native plants, we preserve the genetic diversity of the wild plant populations, because plant DNA moves from our gardens into natural areas. When the plants in our yard are native, those plants are going to make a positive contribution to the wild plant populations. If the plants in our yard are cultivars or non-natives, the DNA may negatively affect the wild plant population. In addition, native plants preserve the natural heritage of a region, so the whole world doesn't look the same. I actually have done, I'm going to do some references throughout the presentation, but I did do a presentation on native plants and native bees, which is on our Lake County Master Gardener Volunteer website. That website address was included on your handout. So, excuse me, category 1, where you can lose the lawn and not miss it. I've kind of divided that category into 4 general areas: gardens with a purpose, meadowscaping, shrubs, and trees. Gardens with a purpose, by that I mean rain gardens, victory gardens or vegetable gardens, and children's gardens. And if you're interested in installing any of these gardens, the Master Gardener volunteers have done separate Meet Us in the Garden presentations on each of these 3 topics. Again, those presentations and the corresponding handouts are on our website. A meadowscape is a fantastic ecological alternative to a lifeless lawn. Meadowscaping just refers to a residential sized meadow or prairie, and meadows are filled with native bunch grasses and wildflowers. If you plant a meadowscape, bees, birds, butterflies, beneficial insects appear seemingly out of nowhere. Meadowscapes can be planted by seeding, which is inexpensive but may take a while to establish. You can buy large container pots of plants, which is immediately gratifying but a little more expensive. Or you can use plant plugs, which I didn't know before I started working at a nursery, but that's a plant plug in the corner. They're just baby plants that the nursery hasn't potted up yet. So if you're interested in plugs, sometimes they are available at your local plant nursery early in the season before they're potted up. And sometimes you can even ask your local plant nursery to order you a special order. It's always worth asking if you're going to need enough plugs for a big enough area. There are so many more suitable plants for meadowscaping than the ones I'm going to feature. I could do a complete presentation on meadowscaping alone. So if you would like to plant a meadowscape, I suggest going to your local native plant nursery and looking over the possibilities. But here are a few suggestions to get you started. Bunch grasses are grasses that grow in clumps. Our native bunch grasses provide seeds for birds, host plants for butterflies, and nesting habitat for bumblebees. These native grasses are warm season grasses, which means they green up later in the season. A mass planting of bunch grasses swaying in the breeze is absolutely breathtaking. I would like to say that I prepared this type of slide for almost all of the plants I'm going to talk about. I won't be going over in detail, reading all the information on the slide, but if you see something you like, feel free to take a screenshot. Little blue stem was one of the dominant grasses of the tall grass prairie, which once covered large parts of the Midwest with big blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass. Little blue stem, it's quite pretty. It has slender bluish green foliage in summer, bronze orange foliage in fall. The flowers are quite delicate and yet persist throughout the winter. It's one of the smaller native grasses at 4 feet tall. Indian grass also has blue-green blades in summer and change to a deep orange to purplish color in the fall. Those golden brown seed heads are wonderfully soft. They kind of fade to gray during the winter, but persist all winter long. Indian grass actually prefers infertile soil. It tends to open up or flap in moist, rich soils, which brings up a good point. Infertile soils are no excuse not to plant a native. I am confident that you would be able to find a native plant for any kind of growing condition you have. Remember that lawn is able to grow, or turf grass is able to grow in so many different conditions because of all the inputs it sucks up. Native plants, if situated properly, will not require those inputs. 2 other native bunch grasses that are quite beautiful that would be good for meadowscaping are big blue stem, whose 3-pronged seed head gives it the name of, common name of turkey's foot. And then switchgrass is a more columnar grass. The blades are rather rough. It's a lovely contrast to the soft pink panicles of seed heads. Both of these are native, both of them are tall. Our native bunch grasses should not be cut back in the fall. You want to wait until the spring to cut back. And in the spring, you wait until there are at least 3 consecutive days of 50 degrees or more before you cut those grasses back to allow for overwintering wildlife to emerge. Myself, I do minimal cleanup and I tend to use plant debris as a mulch. I would also like to say that miscanthus grass is a commonly used grass. It is not native, it is non-native, and it is invasive and crowding out our native grasses in the wild. So please don't plant that. And if you have miscanthus grass, please consider taking it out. Another good plant for a meadowscaping would be purple coneflower. Mine's in bloom right outside my window. It's very easily grown, a happy self-seeder. It was here when the Native Americans were here. You don't deadhead the plant. It will rebloom on its own, and if you leave the seed head standing over winter, you will be feeding the birds, which is a wonderful thing. The plant is interesting because the new flowers have their rays which stick straight out, and then they start to droop as they age. Partridge pea is a native annual that self-seeds to keep its presence in the garden. Its leaves fold upon touch and at sunset. It's very good at filling empty areas. I have read that it is not good at competing with other plants. Mine is planted where in a bed that's very crowded and it seems to be very happy, but I just wanted to share that with you. Members of the legume family, which the partridge pea is, fix nitrogen in the soil, which I will talk about a bit more later. This partridge pea is not deer resistant. Rattlesnake master has bristly sword-shaped leaves and those lovely little balls of a flower. The balls are not prickly and they're not soft, they're rather rubbery, and they are a pollinator magnet, pollinators and beneficial insects. Rattlesnake master, it looks like it would be a member of the yucca family with those leaves. It's actually a member of the carrot family. You don't want to move it once it's established. It has quite a long taproot, but it will self-seed, and I have very successfully moved those little volunteer seedlings. Okay, a couple others that might be good for your meadowscaping. Mist flower is covered with fuzzy blue violet flowers from late summer until frost. It's just starting to bud right now. That grows to be about 2 feet tall. It spreads to form a dense ground cover. So you could use that all alone as a ground cover, full sun to part shade. Butterfly milkweed is a host plant for the monarch butterfly. Unlike other milkweed plants, it likes it hot and dry. The mountain mints are pollinator magnets. All of them are. That happens to be a picture of Pycnanthemum tenuifolium, or slender mountain mint. The mountain mints are colony forming and spread by rhizomes, full sun. Beard tongue, or Penstemon digitalis, that's the bottom left corner. It's a great early spring bloomer. A lovely source of nectar for bees. I have read that it is a good plant for hummingbirds, but I have a lot of penstemon and a lot of hummingbirds, and I've never seen a hummingbird on a penstemon. So maybe if you have, you could put that into the chat. I would be interested. Penstemon is already done or fading out with their blooms right now. All of mine are in seed heads, and you do want to make sure you cut those seed heads off because they're so beautiful. I wanted to leave them up the one season, but that means the plant is putting all of its energy into seed production and it doesn't flower as well the following year. Flat top goldenrod is a goldenrod that's not a solidago. It's called Euthymia graminifolia. It's a happy spreader like all the goldenrods. It gets quite tall, about 5 feet. That's not in bloom yet. But my wild bergamot is. All of the monardas are pollinator magnets. They attract hummingbirds, hummingbird moths, bees, and butterflies. Wild bergamot is quite susceptible to powdery mildew, but that's just something that happens when you grow that plant and don't use chemicals. It doesn't affect the flower and it doesn't affect its value to wildlife. If you are considering a meadowscape, I would like to give you a few tips. Select plants so that you are providing a continual bloom throughout the season to benefit the greatest number of wildlife species. Do realize that plants will reseed and move over time, and that's okay. Leave your meadow plants standing over winter to preserve habitat, provide seeds for birds, cover for overwintering insects, and also winter interest because they're quite beautiful covered in snow. In the spring, you can cut the meadow back just like the grasses after 3 consecutive 50-degree days. If you have a large enough area, I would suggest only cutting half back and leaving half uncut back to preserve habitat. And most importantly, site that meadow where you can see it. Mow a path through the middle so you can immerse yourself and see up close all the beautiful wildlife you are supporting, which is so much more interesting than staring at your lawn. I just have 3 shrub suggestions instead of turf grass. The first one is Rhuus aromatica grollo, which is a fragrant sumac. It's a well-behaved, very tough, adaptable plant. The leaves and the twigs are aromatic. It's a cousin to poison ivy. The leaves somewhat resemble poison ivy, but nothing about this plant is poisonous. It spreads slowly but steadily, and it's good for stabilizing slopes. I'm actually interested. I work at a nursery, and we have a bunch of plants that are unsexed. Fragrant sumac it's dioecious. So it comes, the female flowers are born on one plant and the male flowers are born on a separate plant. And the female flowers, if properly pollinated, will give way to hairy red berries, which I've never seen a hairy berry before, so I'm looking forward to that. I did want to talk very briefly about the use of cultivars. Doug Tallamy has done research, and his research concluded that if a plant is bred for disease resistance or compactness of size, then a cultivar is okay. It still supports all of our native wildlife the same as the straight species does. So that's why I chose this cultivar called Grollo, because it's only 2 feet tall. I was assuming if you want to replace your lawn, you want a low growing plant. The straight species of Rhuus aromatica can get up to 6 feet, and it's quite beautiful. It just takes up a lot more space. If a plant is bred for change of leaf color or change of flower shape, then that's when it is not okay to use that cultivar. It does not support our wildlife. Think of Physocarpus or ninebark, the native is a green leaf. There are a number of cultivars out there with purple leaves. The insects just don't recognize that plant. So that plant does not support our wildlife. So the bottom line is you always need to do your research. Straight species are best, but if you only have room for a cultivar, you're still providing food for bees and support for wildlife, and that's still better than turf. Steeplebush is one of our native spireas. It's a pink flowering, mound-shaped deciduous shrub. It has a yellow fall color. The bark is exfoliating, and the pink flowers, it's interesting, the buds in the bottom left, I have trouble with right and left. The bottom left picture has white buds. Those white buds explode to show a pink flower. We also have a white flowering spirea. It's taller. It grows up to 5 feet tall and wide. Summer sweets are a trouble-free shrub. They're actually one of my favorite shrubs. The straight species can grow up to 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, which is why I chose hummingbird cultivar, which is only 2 to 4 feet tall. There's a couple other shorter growing cultivars. Summer sweets are unique because it is a flowering shrub which flowers not only in part shade, but later in the season than a lot of other shrubs. It's an excellent replacement for the invasive butterfly bush, and the fragrance is quite lovely. Oftentimes when gardeners want to attract butterflies and bees to their yard, they plant perennials and annuals, which is great. But you also might want to consider planting a tree. Trees are a great early season nectar source, and they provide habitat to raise young. If you truly want to attract butterflies, an easy way to do it is to provide a home for their babies. And by doing this, you are also attracting birds because birds eat caterpillars. Back to Doug Tallamy. Doug and one of his assistants, Desiree Narango, have done research, which was the first of its kind, to show that a single pair of breeding Carolina chickadees must find between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars for one brood of chicks. That is a lot of caterpillars for one family. If we don't have the caterpillars, we won't have the birds. Doug and another research assistant, Kimberly Shropshire, have teamed up with the National Wildlife Federation to create the Native Plant Finder. This amazing resource called, called the Native Plant Finder. This amazing resource organizes by zip code the native plants and trees that support our butterflies and moth species. So if you are thinking of a plant, you could look it up here. Input your zip code and it will tell you how many butterflies and moth species that plant supports in your yard. So let's look at just a couple trees and see how many species you could support by planting them. The first one I would suggest is pagoda dogwood. It is one of our native dogwoods. It's a beautiful tree with a distinctive tiered or horizontal branching. Its common name is alternate leaf dogwood because unlike the other members of the dogwood family, which have opposite leaves, these leaves are alternated on the stem. According to the Native Plant Finder for my zip code, pagoda dogwood would support 111 species of butterflies and moths. Pussy willow is an excellent source of early season nectar. Before the foliage emerges, the catkins appear. And this is another plant where male and females are on separate trees. Male trees or male catkins show in that bottom right picture as fuzzy and pearl gray. Female trees produce more greenish, less showy catkins. You know, you have a male plant if you see a lot of yellow, which is in the top left picture. That's the pollen that is being held on the tips of the anthers. Those fuzzy little fur coats are used by hummingbirds to line their nest. And I have seen them take that. Pussy willow supports 328 species of butterflies and moths. And the white oak. Oaks are such an important plant to support our wildlife. Doug Tallamy has recently written an entire book about oaks. It just came out. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I hear it's very good. Oak flowers, again, male and female, different flowers, but on the same tree. The male flowers are yellow and dangling. The female flowers, usually we won't see them. They're very small and higher up in the crown. Oaks have those elongated acorns and beautiful red fall color. The white oak gets a gold star for supporting butterflies and moths. It supports the most of any other plant in Ohio, in anywhere, 477 species. So trees can be a perfect lawn alternative, a small grove of trees underplanted with shade-loving plants. Think of how relaxing that would be to sit under in the summer sun. Or you could just add one. Even if you kept your whole lawn and planted one oak tree, your property is now supporting 477 more species of wildlife than it did before. Category 2, where you would like a green ground cover, but not necessarily turf. These are areas where you can plant a low-growing native plant as a green living mulch. And a green living mulch of native plants will provide all the benefits of wood mulch, such as those listed: suppressing weeds, controlling erosion, increased soil moisture. In addition, it will also provide habitat for wildlife, provide food such as berries and leaves, and it won't blow or float away. The second gold star of my presentation and the last gold star is wild strawberry. In all my research, wild strawberry was the only native plant I found that could withstand the heavy foot traffic that turfgrass does. So that's why this one gets a gold star. It spreads easily by stolons or runners, which are root structures that crawl along the top of the ground and they root as they grow. I have a little strawberry patch that I'm turning into a little patch of lawn that I converted to a strawberry lawn, because I'm trying to experience all the things I'm talking to you about. But I planted that about a month ago with just 7 plants, and they are already sending out root structures, runners and rooting, which is super exciting. I just checked on it yesterday. Dan Jaffe Wilder, who was one of our speakers for workshop, he was a great speaker. He's a horticulturalist from the Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary. When I talked to him in February, prior to our workshop, he had told me he's in Massachusetts and his strawberry lawn was still green under all the snow they had. Strawberries are fast spreading and you can mow them, but I don't know why you'd want to. The wild strawberry does produce fruit, which is edible, and Dan says it is delicious. I haven't had any yet. Wild strawberry does not require inputs and it feeds many pollinators. Antennaria is my second native ground cover, low growing. It's commonly called pussy toes because the flower in that bottom left picture resembles that of a kitten paw. There are a number of different species that all work well as a ground cover. I have them all growing in my yard. Plantaginifolia is the one that's the top left picture. That's the one with the largest leaves. It spreads quite quickly. I planted mine about 2 months ago, and it has already doubled in size. These plants are dioecious, which means separate male and female flowers on separate plants. The male flowers are typically supported on shorter stems than the females, and this is a host plant for the American lady butterfly. Prairie smoke is a distinctive wildflower. Each flowering stem holds 3 nodding bell-shaped flowers, which when pollinated or when fertilized, will turn into that beautiful puffy seed head. Almost, it reminds me of when we were little and we had the pencils with the troll heads on top and you roll them and their hair sticks straight up. It's a beautiful pinkish haze if you can get a large enough patch. These plants spread slowly by rhizomes. They're perfectly suited for dry rock gardens. It doesn't like to be overcrowded by taller perennials, and it will die out if it's subjected to wet winter soil conditions. So you need some good drainage. And while not truly evergreen, their leaves do persist throughout the winter after turning a pretty shade of red in the fall. Moss phlox is a vigorous, spreading, mat-forming, evergreen ground cover. Like all phlox, it has 5 petals. That's PHLOX, which is a good identifying characteristic for phlox. The leaves are needle-shaped. This phlox species, Phlox subulata, is resistant to powdery mildew, which many phlox are not. It spreads easily, even in poor soils. I actually like this plant after the flowers are gone because I really like the way those leaves look. There are other phlox species that can be used as a ground cover. Phlox stolonifera, or creeping phlox, is another low-growing phlox that can be used in full sun. It's kind of hard to find, but if you find it, it's a really great plant. And Phlox divaricata is called woodland phlox. It prefers the shade. Labrador violet, I just planted that this year and I'm absolutely in love with it. Low growing mounds of that dark purplish green foliage, which will persist throughout the entire season. It is not evergreen though. I also wanted to, Labrador violet, it grows to about 6 inches tall, blooms May to July. I also wanted to make a note that common violet would be a good lawn substitute. I actually have that at volunteer seeded in my garden beds and I let it grow. It does a good job of blocking out other weeds. That common violet is taller than the Labrador violet. It gets to be about 9 inches tall, full sun to part shade like the Labrador violet. The violets spread by underground rhizomes and self-seeding. Golden ragwort is, I like it. Some people think it looks weedy. It thrives in moist, shady locations. It naturalizes rapidly. It has a long spring bloom. I have that it grows 2.5 feet tall, but actually the foliage is only about a foot, 1.5 feet, and then it has a long flower stalk, which brings it to 2.5 feet. The flower stalk, once it's done blooming, just flops over and you can remove it or just let it compose in place. Golden ragwort was recommended as a excellent ground cover by Thomas Rainier in Planting in a Postmodern World, which was a great book. And I cannot remember if I included it on my handout, but if I didn't, it just should have been. And I would highly recommend reading it. In early spring, this plant is very interesting. The buds appear and the buds are a deep, dark purple. And the first time I was introduced to this plant, I was so surprised when those purple buds burst open to show that beautiful yellow flower. Wild geranium will naturalize if it's happy. No need to deadhead because it will not rebloom. Under good conditions, which means it gets enough water, the foliage may remain green all summer. If it dries out or suffers from the heat, the foliage may start to decline. It's a good one to plant underneath trees, so give it a little more shade. You can also do an interplanting with something else that will stay green. A lot of times people will plant asters because the aster foliage comes up late. So as the geranium foliage is fading, the aster foliage is coming up. Right here in that picture, you can see it's planted with golden ragwort, and that makes a beautiful combination. Wild geranium is not deer resistant. And I had to share this with you because wild geranium is commonly called cranesbill, and I never understood that until I found this graphic. The beak of the wild geranium seed pod, the beak suggests the common name cranesbill. As the seed pod in the top right picture dries, the carpels literally catapult the seeds away from the parent plant, and then you end up with those beautiful curlicue structures in your garden. A couple more that I wanted to mention, but didn't have time to dedicate a full slide to. Blue-eyed grass is a pretty plant from the iris family. It grows in full sun to part shade. I would do part shade. In clumps, it has dainty blue flowers. It's quite pretty. I would tend to plant that with another ground cover and maybe with prairie dropseed to interplant that. That would be quite pretty. Prairie dropseed can take more sun. It is one of our native bunch grasses. The flower spires come out of the top. They're very delicate. And some people say that the flowers smell like buttery popcorn. I don't smell it, but I have friends that do. Prairie dropseed can get 2 to 3 feet tall. Meadow anemone or Anemone canadensis is a fast growing aggressive spreader. It can grow up to 2 feet tall in full sun. It may be considered a garden thug. However, it does have its merits. If you contain it by shade or physical barrier, it will provide a thick ground cover that prevents weeds. Um, Given full sun, it will take over the bed, but maybe that's what you want. And then the last one I wanted to suggest here for full sun is wine cups. It's a beautiful native plant, low grower. You want to put it at the front of the border. It can spread with these trailing foliage arms out to 3 feet. It's not a thick ground cover because it just goes out kind of like an octopus. So what I did is I interplanted mine with sedum and thyme, and it makes a really pretty presentation. Okay, on to a couple more ground covers for the shade or part shade. World stonecrop is called woodland stonecrop. That's the common name. It forms a thick mat of those green leaves. In early spring, you get those white star-like flowers. The leaves are fleshy like a sedum and whorled in groups of threes. Unlike most sedums, this sedum prefers moisture and shade. It will grow in full sun, but it won't be very happy, even with extra moisture. And what happens is it sends out those arms, and then the stems die away in winter, leaving newly rooted plants. That's how it spreads. Green and gold is a favorite. It performs a thick, one of my favorites. It forms a thick mat of foliage. It's lovely because it's quite easy to divide. So you want to divide in fall and put it wherever you want to tuck it. I tuck it everywhere. It has a heavy bloom in spring, and then it will bloom sporadically throughout the growing season. I think it's super pretty. It provides little bursts of sunshine in the dark corners of my garden. Foam flower is not aggressive. In the right conditions, it will form a nice ground cover over time. It's evergreen only in mild winters, but the fall foliage is quite pretty. It turns a reddish bronze. Foam flower likes it likes water, but it likes a well-drained area with consistent moisture. So you don't want to allow the soils to dry out, but wet soils in wintertime will kill it. So you walk a fine line with that moisture. Know that Tiarella is related to Heuchera, and if you plant them together in the garden, they will hybridize. Here's a lovely plant combination from a native plant garden in Baltimore. The blue at the bottom is a phlox, the white is the foam flower, and the yellow is the golden ragwort. They all bloom at the same time. I am in the process of recreating this in my yard because I think this is so pretty. And this is what I mean by a living mulch. So that'll stabilize the soil and prevent weeds. Allegheny Pachysandra. This is our native Pachysandra. It's a much slower grower than the Pachysandra, the Japanese Pachysandra that you may be used to. I had to overcome my dislike of Pachysandra when I was putting this in my slide. When we were little, our neighbor had a huge patch of Japanese Pachysandra. Our ball would inevitably go in that huge patch. And then we'd have big fights about who was going to stick their hand in and brave the big spiders to get the ball out. But I know now as an adult that this native Pachysandra is a good ground cover. It has white flowers that are very similar to the foam flowers we've already looked at. The white flowers bloom in early spring before the new foliage appears. The leaves are a matte blue-green tinged with white. The foliage does tend to bleach out if it's grown in too much sun. This plant spreads by rhizomes. And a couple other for shade to part shade or part shade to shade. Jacob's ladder and Iris cristata, what is that? Dwarf crested iris. Anytime you can get blue in the garden, I think that's a big thumbs up. Jacob's ladder will spread by self-seeding. It's called Jacob's ladder because the foliage, you can kind of see it in the background, forms leaves as if it was a ladder. It will get to be, let's see, Jacob's ladder is about 1 foot tall. Wild ginger is in the top right picture. It has heart-shaped leaves, beautiful flowers that are kind of a deep wine, a maroon color. You very rarely see the flowers because they grow on the ground underneath the foliage. Wild ginger, our native wild ginger, can be distinguished from the European ginger because our wild ginger has a matte leaf. European ginger has a shiny leaf. Iris cristata, the dwarf iris, can grow up to 8 feet tall. It prefers shade and spreads by rhizomes. And then that last picture with the little white flower is the white wood aster. It grows in part to full shade. It can get tall, 2.5 feet tall and wide, and it spreads by rhizomes and seeds. And I didn't include them, but you can see them in the background of the picture with the Iris cristata. Of course, you can always use ferns. Ferns are a wonderful thing. Just 3 more plant suggestions. For shady areas, native sedges can be a great choice. Sedges are low growing, grass-like plants. They provide seeds for birds and seeds for other creatures like turtles. So if you like turtles, plant a sedge. Sedges are close botanical cousins of grasses. They look a lot like them. They are cool season growers, so they green up early in the season, just like turfgrass does. They require no fertilizer, very little extra watering, and they do have great deer resistance. This one is creek sedge, which happens to be one of my favorites. It's a clump forming sedge with a fountain-like habit. It will self-seed, but it's not an aggressive seeder, unfortunately. I wish it would be. The green flowers is what's on the inset picture. They're spiky and hop-like. They appear from late spring to early summer, so I'm looking at them now. Plantain leaf sedge, another common name for this is seersucker sedge. You can't really see it in this picture, but the leaves of this sedge are puckered like a Christmas ribbon. It's really very interesting. Also, at the base of each leaf, it comes out of the ground reddish and purple, again, giving in my mind that Christmas theme of red and green. This prefers shady, moist, rich soils. This carex is a host plant to several woodland butterflies. It slowly colonizes from short rhizomes, and then it will be easily divided. Pennsylvania sedge, it looks much like our standard turf grass. Unlike the previous sedges, it has very fine textured leaves. It grows actively in spring and in fall when the temperatures are cooler, just like turf grass. Planted 1 foot on center, those plugs will fill in to form a low growing ground cover. It doesn't need mowing. Most sedges prefer moist to wet soils, but this particular sedge is a good ground cover for dry shade. It's semi-evergreen, which means in moderately cold winters, it will still be green. It is able to withstand light foot traffic. I read that you can't walk on it on a daily basis. And again, you can mow it. I don't know why you'd want to, but if you feel the need to mow, it would just need mowing 2 to 3 times a year. I'm actually in the process of installing a Pennsylvania sedge lawn. It's a beautiful plant and it really does look quite grass-like. Remember, for all of these ground covers, it will take some time for them to fill in. Remember the saying, the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. All right, the last category is where you want to keep the lawn. Flowering bee lawns are turfgrass lawns with low-growing perennial flowers mixed in with the turf grass. You can walk on them, you can mow them like a regular lawn, and yet the flowers will provide food for pollinators. Usually what is recommended is Dutch white clover, self-heal, and which is the purple one, and creeping thyme. Those are recommended not only because they are rich sources of nectar and pollen for bees, but also because they withstand foot traffic, they bloom at low heights, and they keep growing after they're mowed. You might want to, or I would suggest allowing the vegetation to grow at least 2 to 2.5 inches, so to maximize the bloom. It is best, I have read, I have not done this one yet, but it is best to dormant seed in the fall so that you don't need to worry about watering. If you seed in the spring, you would want to make sure that you water for the first 30 days to help with establishment. Flowering bee lawns need a pH between 6 and 7. It's always a good idea to perform a soil test before you plant anything. And if you're going to plant a flowering bee lawn, you might want to do it some months before you plant to allow yourself time to correct the pH if necessary. There is a link to purchasing a soil test on my handout. Dutch white clover is a nitrogen fixer. Like all members of the legume family, it is able to transform atmospheric nitrogen gas into an organic form of nitrogen in the soil that can be taken up by plants. It works with the bacteria in the soil. It's quite magical. And it's wonderful because it means no fertilizer. You do need to know when you are planting a flowering bee lawn, it would be very hard to use an herbicide to kill out weeds, because of course, if you use an herbicide to kill out weeds, you are going to kill that flowering bee, the flowering bee plants. You can always find a sign to publicize what you are doing. So installing a flowering bee lawn is a wonderful thing, and educating your neighbors and encouraging them to install a flowering bee lawn is an even more wonderful thing. And if you don't want to install an entire flowering bee lawn, how about just letting those weeds grow? They provide a wonderful source of nectar for pollinators early in the season. In the spring, my garden beds are a sea of purple dead nettle, which is the top purple flower. I have tons of queen bumblebees buzzing all about. And that one's a lovely weed to let grow because it goes dormant and it kind of fizzles away all on its own. I did want to touch on microclover because someone usually has a question about that when we talk about flowering bee lawns. Microclover refers to a smaller variety of white clover, smaller leaves, fewer flowers, and a lower growth habit compared to the Dutch white clover. It's got a less aggressive clump forming habit. It does still fix nitrogen in the soil. It mixes well with turfgrass blends. However, it does not tolerate high heat or drought or shade, and it does die back in the winter. So I think your better bet would be the Dutch white clover. No-mow lawns. There are several products online that are advertised that call themselves some kind of variation of a no-mow lawn. These blends are predominantly fescue turf grasses or completely fescue. Fescues are usually not mowed. They fall over when tall, and they seem to resemble, in the pictures that you see online, this wavy green ocean. Fescues would still need the fertilizers that our traditional like Kentucky bluegrass and ryegrass do, but they do have the ecological benefit of not needing to be mowed. But I did discuss no-mow lawns with Ed Nangle, who's a professor in the OSU Turfgrass Science Program, and he informed me that fescues are not tolerant of traffic, so from kids, from pets, from adults. They are also intolerant of sun and heat. So his conclusion was, and I quote, fescue no-mow lawns may be an option in shaded areas with very limited use, but expect imperfections in the summer heat regardless. He told me that OSU is currently trialing fescue lawns down at Hinckley Hills and at the main campus, and neither lawn looks anything like the pictures that you see online. So fescue lawns may be another alternative, but you might want to manage your expectations. Regarding best practices for turf, one of our Lake County MGVs did a presentation last year titled Preparing Your Lawn for Next Spring. He provided a great handout titled Lawn Care Calendar for Northeastern Ohio. Both his webinar and the handout are available on our website. I also provided a link on my handout to an Ohio Line fact sheet from OSUE titled Natural Organic Lawn Care, which goes into extensive detail on best practices for turf. So before I finish up, we have to go over how to kill your lawn. It's always best to kill the lawn first before you plant a lawn alternative, except if you're doing the flowering bee lawns. I will say that I have done lawn alternatives without killing the lawn, and you're just setting yourself up for pulling out tufts of grass from in between your desired plantings for years to come. So I would highly recommend killing the lawn first. The first way to get rid of the lawn is by physical removal of turf. So the sod is the first 1 or 2 inches of soil. You want to remove that. You can either use a shovel or a sod cutter. Um, that sod contains valuable organic material, so don't discard that. You can use it to fill low spots in your yard, or you can turn it over, let the sun kill the roots. As soon as you know it's all dead, you can go ahead and put it back in the area that you're planting. Um, there are pros and cons I'm going to go over for each way of removing your turf. The pros are that it's fast and it won't affect beneficial insects. The cons are is that it is hard labor, except if you have an 18-year-old son who is willing to do it for you. That's my son in the picture. Solarization is the process of placing a clear plastic tarp over the lawn to heat it up and kill the grass. This produces a greenhouse effect. So you need to make sure that you bury the edges to maximize that greenhouse effect. And what happens is the sunlight comes through the tarp and it heats the top 12 to 18 inches of soil to lethal temperatures. The heat encourages seed germination and plant growth, but then by blocking out any source of water, it eventually kills everything underneath. There's always the question, should I use clear plastic or should I use black plastic? And I have found a number of studies that concluded definitely clear. That clear plastic allows light and heat to pass through, where the black plastic absorbs light. So it will take less time if you're killing with clear plastic than black. It still will take 6 weeks to kill the turf with clear plastic. The pros is that it is simple. It has minimal labor. There's no chemicals. It will not affect beneficial insects. The cons are the time it takes to kill the lawn. It can be unsightly. It must be done in hot weather. And there's always the question of the disposal of the tarp in the landfill, which we don't want to increase our landfill. I did talk with professors in the Department of Entomology at Ohio State University about the effects of these methods of killing turf on the beneficial insects and beneficial soil fungi in the lawn. And they told me that solarization does not affect them. While solarization may kill insects, pest insects in the lawn, that the beneficials either go down deep or they go dormant during the solarization process. Once you take the tarp off, you add a shovelful of dirt from another area of your yard, and the beneficial insects will recolonize and undormant themselves. Chemical removal of lawn, that's using something like a glyphosate, which is a broad spectrum herbicide, which means it will kill everything that it touches. You need to apply this to actively growing lawns. If you're using glyphosate, do not water within 48 hours of treatment. A couple things about glyphosate. It is not persistent in the soil, which means it has no pre-emergent activity. So it will not prevent weeds. So you can't spray a lawn and expect the weeds not to germinate. It also has a very low leaching risk, which leaching is the movement of a material through the soil profile. So there's very little worry about runoff with glyphosate. Again, per that discussion with the professors in the Department of Entomology at OSU, beneficial insects and soil fungi, they said, are buried deep enough where they should not be affected by glyphosate. So the pros of this is that it is quick and it will not affect beneficials. The cons is that it could be expensive for large areas, and there's always the worry of drift or unintentional kill. And then the last way, this is the one I usually do, sheet composting. You're just layering materials on top of the lawn, which kills and decomposes the lawn in place. You're starving your lawn of light is what you're doing. You cut the grass as short as possible, cover with newspaper, cardboard, or ram board, which is something that Dan Jeffy Wilder suggested. It's actually a material that they use in construction. You can buy it. I don't know if you can buy it in the big box stores, but I saw it online. It's just a thicker cardboard. You want to make sure that the edges overlap so no sunlight can get through. You water the paper or cardboard or ram board, cover it with your layer of compost and mulch, and then over time, everything just decomposes. You can cut into that and plant right away, or you leave it standing and wait till everything decomposes and plant. What I do is when I want to widen a bed, I use this method and I do it in the fall and let it just sit over winter. And in the spring, boom, it's done. So hopefully I have convinced you to improve biodiversity in your little part of the world. It's okay to start small. Let's change the message that our properties are giving to others. Let's not send the message that we use chemicals and religiously mow and waste water on a lawn that doesn't provide for anything. But how about the message that we love pollinators and birds and beneficial insects and the earth? I have this link on my handout. There are members of the Ohio OSU Extension Nursery Landscape and Turf teams that get together periodically. And then as a result of that discussion, they send out email alerts of various activities that are happening in Ohio, all throughout Ohio. Very interesting, very informative. If you would like to sign up for alerts, you visit that website. This is the OSUE Beagle alerts, and Beagle stands for Buckeye Yard and Garden Online. And yay, I am so excited. This is my first public announcement. We are planning on having our annual Home Gardeners Workshop face-to-face at Lakeland Community College, March 12th, 2022. So if you are not by chance on our workshop email list, you can email us at mgblakecounty@gmail.com. That email is on the handout, and I will make sure to add you to our list. Workshop is super fun, and I'm not saying that just because I am the chairperson of workshop. It's a wonderful day of learning and friendship. So I hope to see you there. Thank you for spending your morning with us. I hope it was enjoyable.